tonight. Before we start, what I'd like to do is set a bit of an intention for this conversation. Sometimes it feels like systems change is completely out of our league. I mean, tackling the food system and the agricultural system, how could we even do that as citizens? And yet it can be done. We've done it before. We've done it with entry into the digital economy in just a few years. We did it with the NHS after the Second World War. So I'd like you to be in a mindset of possibilities. Behind me are a few notions of what a regenerative system could look like for food and agriculture. So ideally, we would be transitioning from an extractive system on the right to a regenerative system on the left. We can pick this up a little bit later, but just bear them in mind as we go through this conversation. So as you know, we have a very extractive relationship with nature. Our soils are depleted at nearly 50% globally, which leaves us with about 30 to 100 years of topsoil left. That's 30 to 100 harvests left. And yet, nature's operating system is regenerative. If you let your garden be, it'll grow back, it'll go wild. If you cut yourself, your wound will heal. So, how can we unleash the power of regeneration into healthy soils? I will just run through a couple of quick concepts about regenerative agriculture, because there are many schools of regenerative agriculture. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. So let me just manage the tech here. Next slide, please. Is it me? Is it you at the back? Oh, great. So healthy soils. When I talk about healthy soils, I want you to picture rich, dense chocolate cake kind of texture. That's what healthy soil is, full of life and full of carbon. What are the benefits of healthy soil? You're looking at nutrient-rich food. We could feed more than 9 billion people with healthy soils. And we could feed them nutritious food and affordable food. There's a bit of serendipity in this. Oh, there we go. Healthy soil also allow for restoring water cycles. Think of healthy soil as sponges. They hold so much water, which they can then feed back into the smaller water cycles and then the larger water cycles. And that makes soil much more resistant to droughts. Increase in biodiversity, of course. So if you take a little teaspoon of healthy soil, you have more bacteria in that than you have human beings on Earth. And that, again, creates so much resilience for agriculture to fight against pests and other types of disease. And finally, reversing global warming. It looks like, and there are various studies on this, we could sequester all of our emissions into healthy soils globally. So that's the massive power of healthy soils. And looking just briefly at regenerative agriculture, we're going to be using different words during this session. It could be sustainable farming, agroecology. I mean, they're interchangeable, so don't be confused by those. It's really a matter of personal preferences for some of our panelists. I'm still trying to flick forward, but it's not happening. Anyway, I'll talk you through the just 5 principles of regenerative agriculture. The first one, and I'll keep clicking, hoping something happens. The first one is no tilling, no disturbance. You want that soil to be as intact an ecosystem as possible. You don't want to be digging into it too much. You don't want chemical entrance to disrupt the fungi and all the life and all the structure that's in healthy soil. There we go. Increased biodiversity. So monoculture is a human invention. Thank you. It's a human invention. It doesn't exist in nature. We only find highly biodiverse ecosystems in nature. And obviously that creates resilient ecosystems. Soil armor. Regenerative agriculture promotes what we call cover for healthy soils. So that means it can be leaves, it can be previous crops, and it acts like the skin of the soil. It prevents the soil from being dehydrated or suffering too much topsoil loss. living roots, constantly all year round, having plants on top of the soil, pushing carbon into the soil and keeping it alive and rich and fertile. And finally, animal integration. So that's quite a controversial one, but having animals roam a landscape through organized patterns to fertilize and, again, be a part of creating this very healthy soil matter. So moving on from that, I just wanted you to bear these principles in mind as we continue through our conversation. And I would like to introduce our panel, of course. So we have 3 brands here that some of you may know. I'm thinking that we should work with some of you in our restaurant here as well. Will, you're from Daylesford Organic, and Daylesford Organic, for those who don't know how the group is structured, is part of the Bamford Collection. The Bamford Collection is a wellness and beauty and textile and a lot of bio-sourced elements to it. And Will Dennis here is the Chief Sustainability Officer. Charlie Markland from Toast Ale. So Toast I've been following for many, many years. I've been a big fan. Toast is a social enterprise based in the UK. They're a brewery. And what they do is that they collect bread that was going to be waste bread, and they make delicious, fine crafted beer out of that. And Hodmedods, which I have to say I discovered through this conversation. I have a bit of a loss of memory, I'm sorry. Nick Saltmarsh. And Hodmedods have been working with farmers. They've got relationships with 30 farmers. And what they do is that they look at underutilized grains. So there'll be pulses and lentils, and work with farmers to transition to more sustainable practices. And not only do they produce these grains, but also look to distribute and sell them. And these grains are highly nutritious and have a very low environmental impact. So thank you, all 3 of you, for being here today. And just to start, really, and you'll have different points of view on this, but in terms of regenerative agriculture, what are the main hurdles, whether you think about the UK as a whole or your own businesses, in terms of adopting regenerative agriculture at scale? Who wants to start? Nick?
Yeah, well, I'll start on this. So for me, one of the biggest challenges is a lack of understanding of what regenerative agriculture is. And I think everyone could benefit from Alice's primer, which was fantastic as an overview of the different components of regenerative agriculture. But all too often, I think there's a tendency to sort of pick on one of those aspects. And there is also a tendency for, because regenerative agriculture isn't rigorously defined anywhere, it's not like organic standards which are set down in law, and if you want to grow food organically and sell food that's organic, you have to meet those standards, and you're audited every year against those standards to check that you're doing all the things that those standards required. That doesn't exist for regenerative, so there is a danger that producers, whether that's the farmers or the food businesses, manufacturers, brands, can pick and choose and pick on one of those aspects and then use that to say that the agriculture they're supporting, the agriculture they're practicing, the food they're selling is regenerative, but it doesn't give the complete picture. And that, I think, can potentially dilute the power of this change that we need, because we do desperately need to change our farming system, to change our whole food system, but we need to consider the whole range of aspects of farming and food rather than just picking on a single thing. The minimum or no tilling is often the thing that a lot of big food businesses have sort of hit on. And that can also have unintended consequences, because if you stop tilling, you may well need to spray off the fields so you can sow the seeds for the next year. And then you may be avoiding the damage to the soil structure from tilling by not ploughing the land, but that comes at the big compromise of having to use more spray. So we need to approach it holistically. That's not easy, it's a big challenge, and we've got to keep in mind all the different aspects of true regenerative farming.
Thanks for that, Nick. Perhaps I can just butt in and ask you, Will. Your brand is called Daylesford Organic. I'm sure you get that question all the time. What's the difference between organic and regenerative?
All the time, yes, every day. I think the key thing is to and Nick's done a really good intro to understand that both organic and regen are partners in a movement towards a better form of farming. As you said, Nick, the problem is that the food system is broken, and we have these two concepts of agriculture. One of those is degenerative, and the other one is restorative. And then within restorative agriculture, you have lots of different streams. Now, we would say, because it's in the brand name, that organic is the gold standard. It is entirely nature-based, and this is, again, another key factor, that all of these things with restorative agriculture require being led by nature, and that's a key part of regen. However, nature-led and natural are two very different things. So organic, completely chemical-free, certified, no GMO, no antibiotic use routinely, whereas regen is all about taking smaller steps towards the bigger picture of working with nature to produce food. So the way that we define it is that if you can, you should be striving for the best possible standards. But as Nick has rightly said, there are too many people who just want to pick and choose, like a pick and mix, what they want to do. And some of these things are not going to move the dial enough in agriculture for it to be worthwhile. So actually the biggest hurdle is getting wholesale buy-in to what regenerative should be. And I think one of the key things for us is that in order to sell something under an organic label, a minimum of the ingredients needs to be, 95% minimum of the ingredients has to be organic or from organic sources. There is no minimum to regenerative sourced ingredients. So if you bought a regeneratively farmed sandwich, for example, I don't know if that exists, it could be 1% from a regenerative source. And I think that's the biggest hurdle, is having some clearer definition. We've got the 5 pillars, fine, but we need clearer definition at shelf.
So big risk of regenerative washing. Charlie, you have recently been interested in plugging some regenerative produce into your beer and your process. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you found trying to do that?
Yeah, so just as a very quick recap on beer, the main ingredients: barley, malt, hops, yeast and water. And barley does make up about 25% of your ingredients. So finding regenerative barley would be a very strong step towards the ultimate goal of, I guess, yes, exactly, being organic. And but interestingly, we've struggled to get a hold of it. So the classification issue arises because we don't want to be at risk of washing, but simply finding farms who have gone through the process. Because even if you, and forgive me, you guys will know the exact numbers, but even if you're meant to wait sort of 7 years before you can be the soil can be classified as organic again, even with regenerative farming, without a criteria, it still takes a few years before the quality of the yield is good enough. And barley used in beer, we do want super premium ingredients, because the majority of the barley that would come out of the first few years of regenerative barley would be really only suitable perhaps for animal feed, mainly not as out of snobbery. It's literally about like starch, enzymes, proteins, things like that take a while for nature to recover from. So for us, it's a supply chain issue. The will's there. We're essentially on like a 2-year waiting list with a couple of the biggest operators in this space, and so that's been our biggest challenge by far.
We've already got a headache at the complexity of this nascent system. And Nick, you've been working close to farmers for a long time, and you've built these very, very strong relationships. When they're looking to transition their practice, they could be going against the grain of what their parents used to do, and perhaps they get a lot of pressure from their families or their communities. So they're facing emotional challenges, they have financial challenges, because we have this thing called the J-curve. When they want to step into these more sustainable practices, they have to pay for new machinery, they have to pay for new irrigation systems, they have to front all that capital before they can see a return on that investment. So they're carrying all this risk and pressure on their shoulders. So what do they need to be empowered to transition to a more regenerative, more sustainable type of farming?
So fundamentally, farmers need our support, and they need that support both in a sort of community sense, but also obviously in a financial sense. A farm has to be a working, viable business. So we've got to be paying our farmers a fair price for the crops that they grow, and we've got to be doing that in a way that doesn't require artificial support from a subsidy system that essentially pays for the sort of hidden costs of farming. So for too long, we've been led to believe that we can buy very cheap food and farmers will be supported, and there's negative consequences from the way we farm and the way our food is produced that are absorbed by society, paid for by the government, or by cleaning up waste, or just suffering the consequences of the degradation of the environment. So the farmers need a fair price, and that's why for us it's critical that we have close relationships with our farmers, and we don't just pay them the going commodity price. Farmers tend to be price takers. They accept that they grow a crop, they're either growing it on contract for a price that's been set according to the commodity price before they sow the crop, or they grow it and then sell it on the spot market for whatever the going price is at the time they come to sell it. And that for farmers is really a lottery. They might do very well if the price is high, the global commodity price, or they might end up selling effectively at a loss if the commodity price has gone down. So we believe in having long-term relationships with our farmers and agreeing prices that can really be very similar with sort of gradual increase year on year to cover their costs, make sure they're getting a fair return, and give them the support they need to grow these crops that allow them to have a diverse rotation, which is one of the key steps towards more regenerative farming.
Thanks. And Will, I mean, you engage with your customers a lot, your consumers, who are fairly high-end customers, and you have a whole storytelling about around your brand, about being farmer first and putting them forwards. But you, in a way, are very privileged because you can employ your farmers, so they have that extra security. So, taking that into account, how do you push them forward in order to scale your practices and be even more ambitious in achieving your targets in terms of sustainable farming, considering that extra security blanket that they have in your situation?
Yeah, so to touch on both points from you and Nick, I think that it's key to understand that everybody has lost touch with how much food should cost. And when you are at the shelf, you will already have a predetermined idea of how much you're willing to spend on a loaf of bread or a pint of milk. And you aren't factoring in the effort that's gone into it to get it there. And as you rightly say, we are in a privileged position to employ our growers. I think, as I said to you before, Jez, who is the head of my market garden, is probably one of less than 10 salaried individuals who work in that space in the UK. So we do have a privilege, but the privilege is the fact that the shop that we're selling from sits next to the farm. And so the entire angle around our marketing, around our visits for customers, is that they have the ability to go and see the effort that's going into it in order for them to be less shocked when they reach the shelf edge and have to pay the going rate. And one of the things that I think is really interesting for anybody who hasn't seen these reports before, there was an amazing report that was released by Sustain in 2022, which was called Unpicking Food Prices. And they took a few commodities and they broke down how much of the profit from each of those commodities actually reached the farmer. So to give you a couple of examples, a loaf of bread, average selling price for an 800-gram sliced loaf of bread is about £1.14. And at the end of that process, the farmer who grew the wheat for that bread receives 0.09 pence, which is about 0.02% of the profit. And when you get down to things like fruit and veg, which have got slightly less middlemen, a farmer can sell a kilo of carrots and receive 0 pence. And as Nick correctly said, they are victims to what the going rate is a lot of the time for those veg. So you get to the point where farmers are genuinely just covering their costs. And a lot of them go into negative profits, of course. So the key thing for us is about, and it's not just at Dalesford and talking to a higher end customer who is more privileged to pay an additional price. It's about trying to encourage more people to inform or reframe how food is priced. Now, in my dream world, you'd get to the shelf edge and there'd be enough space on the shelf for you to be told how much everything costs to get that there, including things like the packaging, so that people value the packaging even rather than just throw it into a bin. We're a long way away from that, but it starts with a commitment, a fundamental commitment to paying farmers a good price. And so if you go into Aldi and you see 15p bags of veg on the shelf end, you've really got to question how much is being lost in that supply chain. Most of it's taken by Aldi, the loss, but yeah.
We have a French brand actually that displays on each of their produce who earns what. And that makes you feel so much better and so much more willing to spend that extra €1 for your pot of jam or whatever ingredient it is. or produce it is. So that radical transparency point, I think, is really important. And why aren't you doing it at Dalesford?
I figured I was walking into that one. I think the reality is that it's not industry practice, and so we don't have to. It's that will be the going line. Private business don't need to show you our working, but the reality is we absolutely should. I think it's a case of it needs to become something that is supported and more transparent from government-led legislation. I think that's something that we need to be doing, because the food system is deliberately not transparent.
And Charlie, historically at Toast, you focused on waste and all the water savings and the emissions avoided from that. And then recently you started working with soil heroes. And I was a little bit baffled by that, because I thought, oh, how interesting, you're going kind of up the supply chain by getting involved with them. Could you talk a little bit about that partnership and why it was set up?
Yeah, for sure. So as a reminder there, so we are a social enterprise, and 100% of our profits go to environmental charities. And in part of being B Corp and doing all our emissions calculations and what have you, we look at all scope emissions, 1, 2, and 3. And 99% of ours does come from scope 3. It's transport of heavy beer. But what we really noticed was that we hadn't really taken this step further beyond upcycling surplus bread, which obviously is wonderful from a circular economy point of view. We hadn't really sort of engaged with what other ingredients we could work on. So we got in touch with, Soil Heroes. For one of our years, we gave all our profits to them, and it was more or less twofold. One was they had started to work out that when they were doing regenerative farming, they were pulling carbon from the atmosphere. And so this was when carbon credits were going. They were trying to work out whether they could sell those and whether there's a market there which could help prop up the effort to move to regenerative farming. So we paid an overinflated price on purpose for a lot of those credits to try and sort of promote that ideal amongst other fast-moving consumer goods. Didn't really pay off to the level that we thought it would. But the other core element that really did pay off was we funded some trials where they were doing companion cropping, which essentially means, they were trying to farm land with at least 2 or even 3 or 4 different crops in the same space. So naturally we said, well, maybe can you see what would work with barley? And it was, funnily enough, legumes. So so this trial went on for several months, and actually the result, the result was positive. I haven't got the detail in front of me, but the result was essentially positive. That it was one more string in the bow to why you might take on regenerative barley, is that it's not just a one crop play and about saving the soil and the biodiversity, and the stats that really pulled us in from biodiversity in particular was of 28,000 species in the UK, about 24,000, so well over 80% are at risk as a result of the current farming practices. And that's just something that the founders in particular felt really uncomfortable about, and that was what pulled us into a different part of the conversation, other than just the classic, we want to be better for the planet, we'll buy credits or what have you.
And that's really building a bridge with the hidden costs of the food systems, which are estimated to be up to $10 trillion, which is absolutely huge. And we're talking about health, we're talking about environmental costs, about social costs. So when we think about food as medicine, perhaps to prevent some of those incredibly high costs that we get, we all know the state of the NHS. Nick, you're really focused on some highly nutritious, very healthy foods. Where do you see the link between healthy soil and healthy food, healthy people? And how can we make that more mainstream and for people to step out of this agricultural food silos into the health and kind of preemptive health directive?
Yes, so I think it's really critical that we don't think of farming as sort of standing alone, and we can have regenerative farming without thinking about the food system as a whole, which we've touched on in the discussion. But it's absolutely critical that we take a holistic view. And the conversation a little earlier about the sort of cheap food culture, that's led farmers into a yield trap where they're essentially chasing higher yields because the price that's offered to them gets lower and lower, and the only way they can get the return they need is by having high yields. But to get those high yields, they need to have more and more inputs. They have more costs because they've got more inputs. More chemicals are going on the land, more artificial fertilizer, which has a big carbon impact. And they're also producing food that it's sort of pumped up by all these inputs. So it ends up being nutritionally much less dense than really good food. And within a sort of holistic approach, we actually quite like the word agroecological, which encompasses the whole food system, not just what happens on the farm, and also addresses the communities that both produce and consume food and the social impacts on those. So within a more agroecological approach, we can be looking at producing less food, lower yields. We can still feed ourselves, we can still feed everyone on the planet if we also adapt our diets. We don't need to go full Bosch from the session before and all become completely vegan. But if we just reduce the amount of meat we eat, we can significantly reduce the amount that we're asking of the land and of farms. More than 50% of the grain grown in the UK is fed to animals. So if we just eat less of those animals and more of the grain and grow more diverse crops, then we can have a farming system that's less input dependent, has less negative impacts on the environment, but also provides us with a lot more nutritious food. Because another fantastic, fortuitous thing is that farming that's good for the environment goes hand in hand with diets that are good for us individually. So if we have those more plant-based diets, we're getting a lot more fiber. Fiber is really the nutrient that we're all lacking in this country, more than any other nutrient. People are often obsessed with protein and think about micronutrients. We forget about fiber. It's a sort of unfashionable nutrient. But really, the key thing to our health, the thing that would most benefit us, would be getting more fiber into our diets. And we get that fiber from more plant-based foods. And we also need diversity of fiber from different plant-based foods. So we need that diversity on farms to get diversity into our diets, better for the environment and better for us.
And it really feels in this country like access to nutritious food, the kind of food you're describing, is for the wealthy, the privileged. I mean, will your customers have disposable income? They have access to this extraordinary range of foods that you produce at Dalesford. Charlie, your beer is a high-end premium brand as well. I mean, regenerative agriculture has at its heart the notion that it should be for everybody, not just the well-to-do who can access this kind of food. And I think that that is particularly prevalent in this country where access to land is quite scarce. It's a very densely populated country. So as much for Toast as for Dalesford Organic, how do you see your role in terms of promoting better nutrition for all people?
Yeah, why not? Give you time to form a great answer. It's interesting you highlight that Toast is a premium product. It's really driven by the fact that at this scale, our scale, which isn't large, we're still in that sort of, it's very expensive, very high cost of goods. Our ambition is, from a personal brand point of view, to obviously get to a stage where our cost of goods go down and we can maintain our margin and pass that saving on. But where we're really putting our money where our mouth is on that is our work on sort of systemic change. So instead of using just 100% barley, we use surplus bread. So think big sandwich makers who make sandwiches for Sainsbury's or what have you. The sides of all those loaves go to waste on the same day. So 44% of all bread made in the UK goes to waste. And so by using that in place of some of our barley, we are, we're significantly reducing the amount of waste, the amount of virgin land required for barley and what have you. So I'll get to the point. That's the story of Toast. What we've always wanted to do is get other brewers to act the same way. And so we open sourced our process, because it's actually not quite as simple as I've made it sound, to use bread as an ingredient in beer, albeit it was actually how beer was made right up until the Industrial Revolution. It was only when land became cheap that it started to use barley instead. But that aside, what we're doing now is we're educating major brewers around the world on the benefits of using this upcycled bread. And we've also found that actually, once the process gets more and more refined, it becomes cheaper than barley. So in the grand scheme of things, all these major brewers like Heineken and Carlsberg and what have you, we're trying to get them to a place where their cost of goods go down. So ultimately, the beer playing field, there's more margin to share on with consumers, ideally, or perhaps not in the case of some of those larger companies. To the point that, we've open sourced the recipe. It's had 100,000 unique downloads by breweries around the world. And we've personally partnered with 87 breweries around the world in 10 different countries to try and get them to incorporate this. So I guess we're not really tackling the how can we make it a more affordable luxury. We're more trying to attack how much waste can we divert and avoid, and try and create that systemic change to get businesses to look inwards. But what will come as a result of that is other savings. So the process that we've defined, we're looking at trying to make it into more of an extract, something that could be used for other food products. So that could significantly impact, say, bread creation. They could use less barley, and they could use our extract as part of this. And that would therefore, reduce the amount of land required to make all the bread. So it's kind of, we've got sort of 3 steps to the left, 2 steps forward. That's how we're tackling it. We're probably not able to sort of single-handedly make it more affordable off the bat.
I'm glad you didn't completely string me up then, because I was going to go down a similar line. I think we've never been shy about charging what it costs. And it's not just about how much it costs to grow organic fruit and veg. Everyone says, oh, we've got less inputs. You still have to think about the costs of running a business, of paying your staff fairly. And in the ideal world, we would be supported by policy, by government subsidies, to be able to give chemical-free, lower input food at the same price as we're currently getting conventional agricultural food. But that's just not the case. And the example I always trot out is that currently we can go out to Peru and we can buy a kilo of non-organic apples for $2.99, $3.99 a kilo, including shipment, and yet we've got to pay $7.99 to source from an organic Kent orchard for the same quantity of apples. We are hamstringing ourselves in terms of being able to promote these foods to make them more accessible. But I think the key point that I wanted to make, and hopefully this is a good place to put it, is that we're trying to again show people that they should be comfortable with spending more money on food. And that's a really polarizing view, because everybody's number one priority is feeding their families and doing it as affordably as possible, because everything else is so expensive. But if you look through some of the ONS stats, and I'll throw some stats at you because it's the end of the day and that's what everyone wants before they have a beer. In the last 60 years, and this is the stats they released in 2017, so they've changed slightly, the amount that we spend on food has gone down from 33% of household income, and in 2022 it was down to 11%. And that's obviously because commodities are changing and food is generally getting cheaper and in many cases worse for us. Conversely, as you'd expect, housing, fuel and energy has nearly doubled and a half, particularly since Ukraine. So there are lots of really good reasons why people want to spend less on food, but they've also lost the enjoyment of food and sourcing their food. We're no longer going out to the baker and then walking down to the greengrocer or speaking to our local farmer. We are just going to a one-stop shop, literally, and getting everything in for the week as quickly and cheaply as possible. And so, we're not doing enough to make organic veg accessible, because we don't want to have to then not employ as many people and pay them nicely. But at the same time, we want to show people that the link between where their food comes from is just as important to them as how much they're spending on it. And as Nick mentioned right at the start, there are so many unintended consequences of buying into the cheap, broken food system in terms of health, and all of the costs that you're paying later on down the line that people don't see immediately, that they need to be aware of. And so certainly for us, part of the organic and then soon to be regenerative movement is about promoting the impact long term, and understanding that, fine, it's going to cost you this much money for an organic carrot, but if you factor in all of your future costs as well, this will do you right.
Yeah, which brings me to, you're leading to capitalism 2.0 there, kind of thinking about how to take care of your people and that kind of regenerative outlook when it comes to business. So zooming out slightly away from food and ag specifically, and Charlie, you've mentioned the transformative partnerships or the very bold collaborations, collaborating with your competitors, which really, when looking at it, I thought about the survival of the fittest and kind of Darwin's law, and which capitalism has leaned in massively, effectively pointing to the fact, or so we thought misguidedly, that Darwin was referring to the fittest being the most dominant player, who would be the winner takes all, effectively. But what Darwin was actually referring to is not so much the dominant force, but the most collaborative, the one that is most able to adapt. And that took me to Toast Ale and your collaborations, as well as the fact that obviously you're donating your profits to charity, and your open source approach, which is very, very bold for a business, even a social enterprise. So could you go into a little bit into that and the resilience that you're hoping to create by effectively applying this capitalism 2.0, hopefully within planetary boundaries, something we can all dream of, but you're really very activist in the way that you run the business.
Yeah, and in spite of that, there is a commercial backbone to how we operate. So, you know, it would be absolute madness to like completely give away everything that makes your business unique, because you will disappear. So taking that, your sort of survival of the fittest, I agree that it's about collaboration. Like, you know, there aren't many cannibals left in the animal kingdom. It doesn't really work. But equally, I think there's sort of almost a health fitness in there. And I think a healthy business will know how to collaborate to a level that grows the size of the pie for everyone, but doesn't give up their sort of full secret sauce. And I don't think that what I guess I'm not saying is that there's something we hide that from the recipe, but and from the process. But there is that tacit knowledge that is very, very sticky and very hard to convey in when we do this. Like, we've been doing this for 8 years, and so we open it up, we share as much as we can. We have people messaging us all the time, asking us for help with problems they're having with their brew, and we will help. But the reality is, we were kind of first in, best dressed, and I think it's because we're open about the collaboration that sort of what goes around comes around really works. So that's driven more PR than I've ever seen a business of this side. I've been in the drinks industry 20 years, similar sized businesses and much larger businesses, and the amount of PR this business gets. So there is a sort of, it's not completely selfless, but it is, in my view, the stronger way to operate. And you know, in a room group full of people, in a room full of competitors in the industry. So that's something we focus on. That systemic change is ultimately what the goal is. And even Heineken, who are the first or second biggest brewer in the world, they invested in our business 2 years ago. But it wasn't the UK business looking at their portfolio of beers going, maybe we should have a sustainable beer. It was actually the global business going, we've got a supply chain problem here. We've got a net zero target here. Like, how are we going to do this? And in the last year or so, we've been talking about, like, where is our protection? Because we are telling you everything about, like, everything. We're taking you through all the warts and all. And they're like, well, you just don't understand that we just don't have the time or passion that you would have to create that 8 years of pain to come up with a fantastic tasting product that has all these fundamental benefits for the world. So there's a balance, and I think I didn't do it. The founders did it. They found a really nice balance between keeping your sort of commercial hat on, but doing something fundamentally transformative for the industry. And to get someone like Heineken to sign up is incredible. And the stat which I was bumbling through trying to tell you yesterday was if all the brewers in the UK did the same process that we do, replace 20% of the barley with upcycled bread, it would halve the UK bread waste straight away. So that is the level of impact we're trying to get, and that's what the brewers are sat there going, yeah, just tell us how, we'll do it. And the bigger ones are sort of got enough foresight to go, no, we're not going to rip you off. We want to really understand this, and yeah, probably they'll acquire us one day because they'll want every bit of knowledge that we have. But essentially, I think that's quite interesting that that collaboration is the survival of the fittest you're talking about.
And thinking about holistic systems and kind of systems thinking around this, Nick, what you do is quite specific in terms of trying to reconnect people to nutrition, to food, to where it comes from, to who grew it, to the soil in which it's been grown. And could you share a little bit about how you do that and how you've been experimenting with that aspect of things? And I think the Bosch TV people were also mentioning that about making it exciting and enticing to find out where your food comes from and why it's important.
So a big part of the motivation for us in founding Hobmedod back in 2012 was that we saw that there was a sort of thriving and a growing local food movement around more fresh produce, dairy products, cheese, locally produced and locally butchered meat, artisan bread. But when you get to sort of grocery products, the foods that you buy from a shop off the shelf in a packet, they are often much more anonymous. There's much less information about where those foods come from, or even what they are. You know, what sort of plant do they grow on? Soon after we started, we were actually asked by a famous food writer, who I won't embarrass, what a lentil plant looks like. You know, very few people think about what lentils look like in the field, because we just think lentils are little round things that come in a pack. So we wanted to show that there is another way of approaching those sorts of foods, as well as the other foods where there is already more provenance and more communication about where they come from and more awareness of how those foods are produced. So we wanted to start telling more of a story about pulses and why most of the pulses we eat actually can't be grown in the UK, but there are pulses that can be grown in the UK and that we've been eating for thousands of years. But we turned our backs on them because we started eating a lot more meat and dairy, and only the poorest people needed to keep eating pulses, so they became the least fashionable, most undesirable foods imaginable. But those pulses, Britain grows the best dried peas in the world, and we grow dozens and dozens of different varieties of dried peas, and yet we hardly eat them. And we wanted to start telling more of that story and explain, you know, where these peas are grown, what they look like when they're grown, who the farmers are who are growing them, how they can be part of a diverse rotation, why we should try and get pulses into every arable rotation in the country and grow 10, 12, 20 times more pulses than we are already. But also that's then not a single crop, it's part of a rotation. So there are other crops, there are cereals. But why is wheat one of the 4 plant species that contribute, I think, 2/3 of our calories globally? I think there are 4 species, soy, corn, rice, and wheat, that basically provide us with 2/3 of our calories. And yet, in the 12,000 years of agriculture, we've domesticated 6,000 different plant species, and yet we're just depending on 4 of them. So why is that? And what are these other species? Could we be growing them in the UK? Can we make them available? Can we talk about who the farmers are who are growing them? And just making those connections, I think, tells us more about our food. It helps us to think more about where our food comes from, think more about what we're eating, think more about those other impacts of our food that we've been talking about, the hidden costs of food, and why more diversity is essential both on farm and in our diets.
And just to finish on this topic with Will and Delsford Organic, I mean, you have the real estate to tell your story. You have these beautiful banners with quite a lot of text on it and copy, and people take the time to read them. So in a way, you've got this very privileged platform to tell the story of organic agriculture, sustainable agriculture, nature-led agriculture. What do you find works in terms of, I mean, you probably see that this messaging is quite complex to get across. You're talking about soils, you're talking about science, you're talking about microbiome, all these different elements about farmer well-being, being farmer first, all of that. What do you find effective in getting that message across? And what do you feel the response is? Have you seen an increase in momentum, in interest in organic food and sustainably farmed foods?
It really varies. So we tend to find that the two things that are the number one connections are something that's very simple. and I mean that in the least patronising way, but a very short, succinct message. And the Organic Trade Board and the Sword Association for Organic September every year have been doing this over the last few years to reduce it down to things like organic is better for the planet, like to make it super simple and similar to the Bosch conversation earlier, try and capture the imagination. The reality is that our biggest successes come from something that goes as close to connecting somebody to where that ingredient has come from as possible. 90% of our business is targeted at getting people onto the farm, either just to walk through it, to go and pick it themselves. All of our classes are experiential, getting people out and doing it themselves. And the rest of it is delivering the hard-hitting stats. So everyone will probably be able to read, but they say that if everybody had the wholesale shift to organic farming, we'd save 40% of global emissions. That's not possible. We're still stuck at 3% of farmers in the UK are organic. That's probably unlikely to change. But if we can keep promoting connection to food and getting more people interested in where their food comes from, it will naturally get them to explore other sources of food, connect with local growers, for example. Again, first of all, they'll find it more engaging and they'll start enjoying food more, but also it'll start to change the narrative a little bit in terms of the type of food that they're accessing.
Thank you very much for that. Just, I think we're wrapping up. We've got the last few minutes. And I did want to ask all three of you to end on a positive note of hope and specifically on those complex topics. What is your vision, all three of you, for the food system and the agricultural system that you want?
Go for it.
So for me, it would be about that reconnection with our food. And a key part of that is having thriving local food economies. So, we can already, depending where we live, buy fresh vegetables that are grown relatively locally, but it's really hard with other foods to buy food that is grown and processed locally. We need more local processing infrastructure. We need small mills on farms around the country, in towns, connected to bakeries. We need bakeries who are buying grain locally and milling it to produce the bread. We need small local breweries who are, using local barley, but also the waste bread from the local bakers. And we need pulse processors as well. In our business, we're reliant on about half a dozen pulse processors in the UK. That's pretty much all there are that we can use to get pulse crops processed. So we need more small-scale processing so we can reconnect people with food that's grown close to them.
And just, you wanted something positive. I feel there are a couple of killer stats here that make me feel really positive. Like, in essence, it seems like caring more about the environment, more about the planet, is less fringe and niche than ever. I mean, even just 10 years ago, it felt a little bit fringe and niche to be very obsessed with the environment and sustainability and the great works people like Extreme and all sorts of other people are doing. I think it's landing, because the stats I was thinking of is 64% of consumers today are now more concerned about the environmental outlook than their own finances, which, given the last couple of years, feels like a really big stat to me. And the other one that lands with me, obviously with a consumer product, is 85% of consumers say they would consider buying significantly more sustainable version of the same product, so more sustainable beer than one which doesn't have any sustainability credentials, if it was A, well signposted, which is becoming better, and Dalesford is a leader in this, but B, if it were of equal price. So there's a challenge there, because we haven't proven that it's worth paying more for to perhaps the less affluent consumer, but it's also an opportunity that they're willing. If we can find a way to get the price there and signpost it, then we can start a switch. And obviously the bulk of the impact that we've talked about today comes from mainstream products. It comes from, massive brands, massive commodity products. So, I think there's a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of consumer sentiment. We just need to translate that into action. The one challenge we have is we talk about being sustainable beer. The proof is everywhere in what we do, but we possibly haven't got to that point, at the tipping point, where consumers go from, yes, I'm very interested in this, I'm very up for doing what I can, to actually paying more for it. So what we need to do is find that balance, try and get it out there at the same price.
20 seconds. I'll wrap up in 20. I think for me, blue sky thinking would be, it's a transparency thing, but it's connecting people to what's around them. We're not going to get rid of supermarkets overnight. That would be a dream, but it's not the answer. It's about promoting individual suppliers, and I think the trend at the moment is bigger suppliers starting to recognise individual farmers and growers, making their customers more aware. And what I'd love to see more of, and Co-op have always been brilliant at this as an example, is individual shops from bigger chains promoting and buying from their local suppliers rather than centralising everything and cheapening it.
Thank you very much. So just to close this session today, I just want to go back to what we have in the background here and to, again, zoom out from regenerative agriculture, food systems specifically, and think about those principles and how they could be applied to our society, to our businesses, to perhaps our families. What does it mean to be health-driven versus profit-driven, to be first mile focused, not last mile focused. So that's farmer first, but perhaps it's just engaging with your local community. So those principles apply to a whole wider set of industries and applications in our daily lives. So if you can walk away with a few of those in mind and try to see how they could apply to you, that would be fantastic. And bear in mind that it only takes 5% of a population who has a very strongly held belief to create a tipping point. So I hope you can join that 5%. Thank you very much. Thank you.